All right, we are live. My name is Kalen from Gamut. Welcome to joining us for episode 2, where we talk all things color. And in particular, this video, we're going to be going over Sony. We get asked a lot of questions about Sony for how to get the best stuff that you can get as we move forward. Make sure that we're still live. Just had something pop up, but I think we're good. All right, so we're going to be going over 6 different things that we're going to be talking about in this video. We're going to be discussing exposure. We're going to be talking about noise levels, clipping points, S-Cinetone, and then also zebras, and then comparing S-Log3 conversion LUTs and how they all kind of play out. So that is where we're going to be spending most of our time today, and then we'll also have some time afterwards that we have submitted footage from some of you, and we're going to be going over how I color grade S-Log3 footage and work through it, and so it's going to be a fun time. But let's go ahead and start diving into the first topic, which is going to be exposure. So I'm just going to flip over here real quick. We also have a blog post over on gamut.io that will have all this information in this video accessible. All the resources, the white papers and things that I'm going to be linking to will be in this video. So first of all, we're going to talk about what Sony actually says for exposing for S-Log3 particularly. So here I have the technical summary for sgamut3.cine and S-Log3. And this is something that's from the Sony website. And this is from Sony telling us how we should expose. And we can look at a lot of different information here, but we're going to scroll down to here on this grid where it explains with this curve with S-Log2 and S-Log3 where we should be positioning our midtones or our middle gray, which is 18%. And right here where it crosses the line, an S-Log3 is where that will be. You can see S-Log2 is a lot lower, which means there's a lot more noise in the shadows there, usually, whenever you're exposing for S-Log2. So we prefer S-Log3. It's much better than S-Log2. Here it says that it has about 1.5 stops wider dynamic range. And then if we scroll down further, we'll see the information that we're looking for right here. And this is where it says S-Log3 from Sony needs to be exposed for middle gray card at 41% IRE. And in the traditional Rec 709 color space, when you are looking at 18% gray, it's about 42%. So very similar to the Rec 709 exposure setting. And if you're looking at 10-bit code values, that'll be 420. But we're going to be looking at just the IRE scale in a percentage-based system. So that is what we're looking at whenever we are considering for exposure. So, all right. Now, some of the reason that a lot of people recommended back in the day, you'd see people saying, I should overexpose by 1.5 stops or 1.7 or 2 stops overexposed for Sony. A lot of the reasons was because the old sensors and the old cameras, whenever they were displaying their noise, there was a lot more noise in the shadows on those older sensors. And since the release of a lot of the newer cameras, it's much better. You get a lot of more clean shadows, and there's not necessary to overexpose as much. However, S-Log3 is very versatile, so if you are overexposing, you're usually able to recover a lot more content than you can in the highlights than you would in the shadows. So we recommend just kind of expose right at 41%, which is going to be like even exposed, not overexposing by 1, 2, or 3 stops. But let's go ahead and take a look at some footage that I have where we will be looking at some shots that we took with a model and what it looks like exposing at different intervals. So, all right. So here we have a clip, and this is, let's take a look at this shot, but this is currently ungraded. This is S-Log3 with just fixed white balance. And if we just turn on our base LUT, we have everything exposed properly. So this is at 0 stops currently. And then we have 1 stop over. You can see how it's starting to look. Then we have 1.7 stops overexposed. And then we have 2 stops overexposed. Now, in this shot, we particularly don't have anything extremely bright, so we're not losing hardly any information, and in this situation, we could recover a lot of it. However, it's not necessary because also this shadow information is not anything we're needing to bring back in this frame. If it was, then we would have lit for it. But in this case, we really just wanted to focus on the subjects, and exposing right at 0 is perfectly fine. If you're outside and you're using that same mindset of exposing 1.7 or 2 stops over, you're going to be clipping highlights. Your clouds are probably going to clip a little bit, and it's just not necessary. So definitely recommend to shoot right at 0 exposure, and you should be good with S-Log3. So let's go ahead and see the next section that we're going to do. And this one is going to be, first, we're going to be going over noise levels. So if you want to test out the noise on your camera and see how it performs, the best way to do that is to take a lens cap, and you're just going to place it over the camera or over the lens, and then you're going to record footage in pure black. And then you're going to bring it in post, and we can see how that noise looks when we look at the scopes, which is what I'm going to do here in just a second. So let's go ahead and migrate back over to our clip. And this is where we're going to take a look at some noise levels. So I'm just going to switch over to my edit page real fast, and we're going to take a look at some noise. Now, because this is on YouTube, it might be a little difficult to see, but on our blog post, I'm going to be taking high-res stills of this so that you can see things in more detail, but we're mainly going to be looking at the scopes. So let's pull up our scopes right here. I think y'all can see this pretty good. So I'm just going to crank this up a little bit, actually more, so you can kind of really see it. And then we're going to scan. So on this clip, this was shot in S-Log3. There is no conversion on this, so this is how it is. And we can see our levels at the bottom right here on our RGB parade. And I keep it in RGB instead of waveform because sometimes you can see red that's pushing higher than the other channels, and that's introducing color noise. So here's a good way to test to see. So we're going to start at 640 ISO. The next one is going to be 800 ISO, 1000 ISO, 1250, and now we're at 1600. You can see the noise starting to get bigger. 2000 ISO, 2500, and we're just going to keep going. More noise in the shadows. Just, it's gross. 6400 ISO, 8,000. This is just, and here's 10,000. This is going to be the worst possible ISO setting you can ever have on the Sony and S-Log3 if you have dual native ISO at 1280, because 12,800, when we go to the next one, boom, perfectly clean. And that's how you can tell where the two circuits are. If you have dual native ISO on a camera and you want to know where it's at, put a lens cap on it, change your ISO, and when you see the noise drop, that is where you're at a new circuit on the camera. So these are the two dual native ISOs on Sony, 12,800 here. And then we can keep going. And there's 16,000, 20,000, 25,600. So to take this into consideration, if we look at this, 25,600 ISO has the same noise level as about 1250 or 1600. Probably 1250 looks a little bit closer to where the noise is. And that means I personally, so I put a threshold here. So at 1600 ISO, I will try never to push my ISO anymore in S-Log3 on this camera. I will jump all the way up to 12,800, add an ND or whatever I need to do because the noise gets worse. And then I just would never go above 3,200 ISO on the Sony a7S III particularly, which is what this was filmed at, because of all that noise that happens right in between those dual native ISOs. So it's better to just increase and bump all the way up to get the cleanest information and maybe stop down or use an ND to get it darker. So as a rule of thumb, you want to stick with 640 or 12,800 ISO, whatever is going to be the native ISO on your camera. Some of them are 800, which is interesting. Some of them are 2,500. So the way to do that, put the lens cap on, check your noise levels, and that's the way that you can tell your noise levels for everything. So that is what I would recommend. And then let me see what else I wanted to talk about. So native ISO does not necessarily mean the cleanest noise levels. It also means dynamic range versus cleanest noise is different. So what that means is when we're looking at footage, we are actually considering that the base of the native ISO does not necessarily mean the cleanest noise. Now, in most scenarios, yes, it does. For instance, in the Blackmagic Pocket 6K camera, the dual native ISO that they recommend is 400 and 3200. However, the dual circuit kicks in at 1250 ISO, which means when you go from 1000 to 1250, instantly it gets cleaner. Now that means that's the cleanest noise levels. However, it's not the most dynamic range. So whatever the camera manufacturer says as the native ISO or the base ISO, that is going to be the optimal for dynamic range, which also usually corresponds to cleaner noise somewhat. However, in certain scenarios, whenever the circuit kicks in, is usually whenever it's going to be the cleanest noise. So keep that in mind. It's not a rule across the board, but for the most part, whatever the native ISO is definitely what you should stick to. And in the case of the Sony a7S3, and the FX30 is going to be 640, 12,800. I think the FX30 is 640 and video too, and let us know in the chat if I am saying anything wrong or if you have any information. That would be super helpful as well. And we can make sure that we're answering that as we continue along. So let's go ahead and continue.
Hey, Keelan, can I ask, can I jump in with a question here?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Adam West in the comments here was asking a question saying, when shooting in areas where the lights are constantly changing, such as a church service, do you suggest setting a high and low with auto ISO or manually change, or maybe like with custom settings? Use it on the FX3, but yeah, curious about like those kind of situations.
Okay, so when shooting areas, yeah, lights constantly changing, high and auto. So the only time I use auto ISO is in a scenario where I'm moving from one scene to the next and I want that to be a one shot. Sometimes I've moved from outside a room into or outside into a location. I'll set it to auto ISO because I want to continue that shot. Usually I know I'm going to probably cut and I'm going to set an ISO manually and then also change it. You can use auto ISO, and I've used it in certain circumstances, but rarely do I ever try to shoot auto ISO because of that fluctuation. I want a little bit more control. Sometimes I want things to be darker, or I want things to be locked in at a certain exposure level. So I always prefer doing it manually, but in certain circumstances, if you're using a continuous shot from a varying level, then I would do auto. But usually I would stick to manual as much as possible. But again, you want the best image. I've noticed whenever I did a ceremony outside, I had a third camera angle down the center aisle, and I noticed that the clouds were coming and it was going bright and dark. And in that situation, I should have left the third camera in auto ISO because it changed so much and it's unmanned. In that case, should have used auto ISO. I didn't, and it was much more difficult to grade in post. So certain scenarios, auto ISO can be great. However, I'd lean into manual as much as possible. So good question. All right. Let me come over here and see what we're working with for the third one. Okay. So, all right. S-Cinetone. Also, S-Cinetone has dual native ISO. It's at 100 and 2000. So if we come over to this clip right here, you can see that we have S-Cinetone, that's 100 ISO, and we're looking at the noise levels, and I'm just cranking it up. I'm now further up, and when I get to the end, you can see also how it's spreading out from the center. It could be that the lens cap wasn't fully on, and you get a little bleed through, but right here I'm about 1600, and then right there it goes to 2000. So you can see that the dual circuit kicks in, and the native ISO is 100 and 2000 for S-Cinetone. So if you're trying to shoot in low light, S-Log3 is better than S-Cinetone because you can also go higher on your ISO range. So keep that in mind. So, all right, let's go to our next section, which is going to be clipping points. Now, this is really helpful information, and this is how I can also identify what cameras and profiles were shot because of the different clipping points. I can tell if something was filmed in S-Log2 or S-Log3, or if somebody was incorrectly below their base ISO, which we'll go into. So when we're looking at S-Log3 footage on an IRE scale in post, the black levels that we just saw, the noise levels, that's going to clip at around 8 IRE, 8.5 I think it is. 8 IRE for black levels, nothing goes lower. And then for the pure white levels, it's going to clip at 88 IRE. That's where we're going to notice the highlights can no longer go higher. It's going to start clipping, and that is going to be the range for S-Log3, specifically when I was shooting on Sony a7S III. So just keep that in mind. And then one big note and one main issue that I see a lot of Sony filmmakers do sometimes is they go lower than their base ISO, and it causes some issues. So let's take a look at some footage here where we're going to go through and look at what happens whenever you shoot under the ISO. Now, this is specific to Sony right now because some cameras do not let you go under their native ISO. It locks you out. However, on Sony, you have those extra intervals below the native ISO with lines above it or a line underneath it. And that's letting you know that you are below the base ISO. And this is what happens. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the conversion LUT, and we're going to look at just S-Log3. So if we're looking over here on our scale, on our RGB parade, we can see that the high levels is clipping right around 88 IRE, and we can't go any higher than 88 IRE. Now, whenever we go to 600 or 640 or 500 or 400 ISO, watch what happens with this clip. And we're going to pull up our waveform, watch the highlights, okay? So here we go. Let's start at 640 ISO, 500, 400, 320, 250, 200, 160, and 100. Yeah. So, and then you can go back to 800 and you can see 800, it still clips the same. So 640 is the sweet spot. If you start going over, you are not increasing any dynamic range. It is not helping you whatsoever. If you look at the entire scale, it is just bringing it all down. Like if you go lower, you might as well just stick at 640. There's no difference. So stick with 640. Do not go lower than 640. If your native is at 800, do not go lower than 800 because your highlights will clip. Sometimes I look at S-Log3 footage and I see, why are the clouds crushed or clipped? They shouldn't be. It's because the person filmed at like 200 or 250 ISO, and they thought that they were being able to bring it darker, and they weren't. So that's why it's important to be able to look at the footage and analyze and know what are the best settings. So S-Log3, stick to that base ISO. It's extremely important. Let's kind of scan over. S-Cinetone is going to be 1 IRE, and then also it's going to be 1 IRE to 100 IRE. So pretty much the full span of the spectrum. And then I would also expose for S-Cinetone right at 0 compensation or a little bit under, maybe a half stop under, because the highlights clip so much faster. Also the black levels do. However, if you do want to film in S-Cinetone and you want to go lower on your ISO, because you want to go lower than your ISO levels because it can go down to 100, I'm going to challenge you to shoot S-Log3 instead, because I'm going to compare S-Cinetone at 100 and I'm going to compare S-Log3 at 640, and we're going to see which one can stand up to better highlight retention and more dynamic range, even by having a higher ISO range. So let's go ahead and take a look at this footage next. All right, so here we have, this is going to be S-Cinetone. So right now we are at, I was shooting at 100 ISO, f4 with a 4000 shutter just to be able to crank it and see how it performs. And we can see that we aren't clipping hardly any information. I'm going to turn off my extents over here, which is kind of giving me a little bit higher range. So right here, we're almost clipping on this tin can. And we're going to go until we start seeing clipping, hard clipping. So now we're there. All right, so I'm starting to clip right about here. You can see we're starting to get a hard line at 100 IRE on S-Cinetone, okay? And this is at 1000 shutter speed. Now I'm getting a hard line on this highlights, and we're losing the higher range of these this tone scale there. And you can just see it just keep cranking, keep cranking. All right, now let's go to S-Log3. I'm going to go ahead and enable my conversion. And also, I went ahead and matched this clip to S-Cinetone just for comparison. So it was a little bit brighter. I was able to bring it down in post just to compare it. So this is 640 ISO, f4, 4000 shutter. And this is S-Cinetone, 100 ISO. And you can see they're almost identical, pretty much. Okay, so that tells me that S-Log3, even though it's a higher ISO, can get just as low as 100 on S-Cinetone. So keep that in mind. And then we're going to just keep going. 3200 shutter speed, 2500, 2000, 1600, 1250, 1000. And now we're clipping roughly at 800 shutter speed. Okay, we still have this little information. We don't have a hard clip right here. So if we compare S-Cinetone at 100 ISO, it clips at 1250 shutter speed, okay? You're going to crank your shutter to really get it there. The same for S-Log3 is going to be, this is at 1250, and you can see how much headroom we still have. We can go all the way to 800 shutter speed before we clip in S-Log3, but we can only go to 1250 on that. So we almost get 2 to 3, like 2 stops more still. And we get lower shutter speed. So if you don't want to crank your shutter, S-Log3 is going to save you more than S-Cinetone. So that's the difference between S-Log3 and S-Cinetone and how they compare. So I definitely just recommend really trying to lean into S-Log3 if you have that option. But if we want to talk about S-Cinetone, let me kind of go over to my settings and make sure we're good. So you might ask, when do we want to film in S-Cinetone? And the reason why I'm saying S-Cinetone is I feel like it's the best 8-bit profile, non-log profile you can have in most Sony cameras now. And also the color hues match up really well. The only problem I have is it clips highlights really quickly and it really crushes blacks fast. So if you want to film in S-Cinetone, I would only do it if it's not a high dynamic range scene and you have a quick turnaround time where you don't have time to really grade. So that's the only situation I would do S-Cinetone. Once you have a high dynamic range scene, you're going to be having issues. I once had a second shooter film a wedding for me. He was in S-Cinetone and a groom was getting ready by the light and his shirt was very reflective. It was blown out, but also the dark levels were already crushed. So I lost all that dynamic range because it's squishing everything in there for that particular scene. So in that case, I wish my filmmaker was in S-Log3 or position the groom in a way that had more even light and had less harshness on him. So also, it's easy to view how S-Log3 looks in camera now because of your gamma assist, and some of the newer cameras allow you to load a LUT, which is important. However, the gamma assist is still not the best. It will look like you're overexposed and clipping, but you won't. And that's where we'll get into zebras in a second. That's going to help you in that situation. I highly recommend working with a monitor on your camera. That way you can see exactly how things are going to look. But if you want to try, if you haven't really done log before and you're just starting, try S-Cinetone first when you get comfortable filming. Obviously, let's work on that before we move into more advanced coloring. And then maybe take a styled shoot or an extra day and shoot stuff in log and see how that works. Also, it's quick to add a conversion on all your footage whenever you're about to edit. So it's not too difficult to really view the footage whenever you're editing. And then let's take a quick example of some models that I filmed that had different exposure levels whenever we were looking at S-Log3 and S-Cinetone. So again, this is an S-Log3 clip, and then this is an S-Cinetone clip. So this was shot in S-Cinetone in camera. This is at 0 stops based off of the metering that I was looking at on the back of the camera. And you can see there's just a lot more contrast in the highlights. So those whites are really hot. And the skin tones right there, if we go over by half a stop, I'm already starting to lose information. And then by 1 stop over, it is just really rough. So if you film in S-Cinetone, be at 0 stops compensation or 1 stop under, because you kind of don't have a lot of leeway with the highlights. It's going to clip really quickly, but you're also going to crush the blacks. All this information over here is pretty much lost. It's still there, but it's really noisy. So I'd recommend 0 or under 1 stop in S-Cinetone versus, S-Log3, where I can just keep pushing to 1.7 and still work with that if I had to. But I just prefer to shoot at 0 stops, just like Sony recommends on their camera system. So, all right, we're getting close to the very end, so thank you for sticking around with me. We're going to be diving into zebras next, and zebras is something that is going to help you as a filmmaker really dial in the best settings whenever you're limited with in-camera operations. Now, what I mean by that is I usually prefer to shoot with a monitor on the top of my camera because I get a lot more clarity with the LUT that I'm choosing versus in camera. Sometimes the screen is a little bit different on cameras, but if you have a calibrated monitor that you're looking through and you're loading your LUT, I just view that. I don't have to turn on my zebras because I expose for what looks good to my eye. But sometimes when we expose for our eye on camera, it can be tricked because the screen is either overexposing the highlights, or we don't have a LUT option very well, or the built-in one is leaning more green or something in the shadows, so we can't control that. So I highly recommend filming with a monitor, but in this case, we're going to take a look at zebras. So zebras. If you have a gray card and we're exposing from middle gray, we're going to set that to 41% standard plus range, plus or minus 1. And then when we look at a gray chart, if you have one, then it should show up around 41% with the zebras enabled. That is going to be the range that we recommend for middle gray. Now remember, I said highlights clip at 88 IRE on the scale whenever we're looking at it in post. But whenever you're in camera, it's different. You wouldn't shoot at 88% because the levels are different, which is very confusing in my opinion. So whenever I was doing extensive testing with it, I noticed between 92 and 95. 95 is going to be the absolute max. Once you go to 96, in S-Log3, nothing shows up on zebras pretty much. So 95 is going to be your max. If you want to have a little bit of space and just extra protection, I would do 94. And you're going to set that to lowest range 94 or 95. And once you see any zebras, that means it's going to be a hard clip or it's going to be clipping in post. You won't be recovering that. If you set it to 93, you might get a little bit of that edge back, but it's about to clip. So I would recommend 94 or 95 for your lowest range, and that would allow you to know if the highlights are clipping. Now, when it comes to skin tone, say we don't have anything that's a gray card on us, or we don't have anything that's super blown out, the next thing that we're going to be exposing for is skin tone. So you can turn on your gamma assist. One thing to note, especially on A7S III, I think also for the FX3, it's going to be different, but the zebras are going to be referencing S-Log3 no matter if you have a gamma assist or a conversion LUT on the actual screen. And however, some of the cameras, I think the FX6 maybe, or FX9, will be reading after the conversion. So if you set your zebras to say 60%, and you're in log, and then you turn on your gamma assist or your LUT, and immediately they change, then that's how you know that the zebras are after the gamma assist or the LUT. But in the scenarios that I've tested so far, whenever you put the gamma assist on or the LUT, it is not going to impact the zebras, which means this information is going to be consistent. So for zebras, we want to turn on gamma assist and try it for 60, and you can compare it. However, for skin tones, I'm going to recommend around 51 with a plus or minus 3. So 48 to 54 feels like a sweet spot that I've tested. Now, again, with different ethnicities and different skin tones, you're going to have a different luminance levels, brightness levels, depending on if their skin is more reflective or it's darker, if it holds more light, or if it displays more light or reflects more light. If you're displaying a light, you're an angel. However, I think that's going to be really helpful because I see a lot of different people recommending different exposure settings. The biggest thing is, you're setting your middle gray, and the skin tone should lie around there. So I've set mine to 51, and that feels like a really nice sweet spot to get. Again, this is not a hard rule for skin tones. This is just a recommendation. Lean into what looks good to your eye. If you're filming or if you're shooting with a monitor and you've got your LUT enabled and I really want to lean darker in that image, then go with that. Disregard the zebras for skin tone. This is only for people that just, hey, I want to just check it. I want to know if I'm in the right range. This is a really great way to know that. And then I usually turn that off so I'm not distracted by zebras when I'm filming. But this is a good, standard that I'd recommend is around 51 with a plus or minus 3. And I feel like that gives a good enough range for bright levels. And that's going to be for the bright level of the face. So if you have light coming and it's going to be brighter on this side and darker, that range is we're going to be reading the brighter side. So keep that in mind. All right. Let's see. Okay, I'm gonna scoot over. We're almost done, and then we're going to have some more questions and Q&A, and then also grading some footage, which is going to be fun. Let's take a look at some footage over here. So one thing I wanted to discuss really quick was the different conversion LUTs. So when we're working with Sony S-Log3, there are so many different options to convert our footage. And I have done a lot of research on different ways to convert footage. We've created our own base LUT from Gamut that people have used. And I've downloaded a lot of different ones. And we're going to go over a lot of these different LUTs so that you can make the best decision as you're choosing what conversion you want to use. So let me see. So this is the original clip right here, and this is properly balanced. I went ahead and set my exposure to make sure it's dialed in perfectly, and then I had the skin tone, everything. So we have some dark ranges, we have some bright ranges. We don't have anything clipping. Now this is going to be a little bit helpful if people want to know this information in detail. So I went ahead and downloaded a lot of and purchased all these different LUTs so that you can make the best decision. So we're going to be working with our Gamut base LUT. We're going to work with a color space transform built into Resolve. We're going to do Sony's conversion LUT that they have from their website. We're going to look at Phantom LUTs. We're going to look at Buttery LUTs. We're going to look at Tropic Color that has one, and then also LUTCO, Evan from LUTCO. So those are the main ones. If you have other Sony conversion LUTs that you use that you like, please let me know in the comments, and I would love to check them out. I'm always interested to see what people are using and how color is influencing my footage. So what I went ahead and did is we're going to just take a look at this. Now, I'm not saying some LUTs are better than the other. The goal for this is to showcase the nuances of it so that you know how your footage is going to be influenced, whether things are going to be pushed one way or it's more saturated or more contrasty, because that influences how you're going to color and correct your footage across a spectrum of footage. So let me go over to our gallery. I took some stills earlier today for this, and we can kind of take a look at some of them. So I'm just going to have our base LUT first loaded up, and next I'm going to look at a color space transform. So the color space transform is going to be, I think it kind of looks very similar. We're going to look up at our scopes here, and this is where we can kind of check everything out. And let me do a wipe over here. So we can go down to CST right here. Okay. So we're looking at the footage here, and we're just going to look at our scopes and see how it is. So the CST is going to be a little bit more a little bit more saturated. It looks like skin tones are lined up perfectly. We're looking at this vector scope here. We're looking at how all these colors, the further away from the middle, the more saturated they are. So you can see the CST is going to be a little more punchier with the colors. The skin tone looks still pretty good. Let me see if I can get a little bit closer. There we go. So we can do our wipe. Skin tone's going to look pretty close. It does look like the red here, the red on this chart is a little bit more vibrant, as well as the pink one. But overall, they should be very similar. And those settings I have are going to be DaVinci tone mapping, and then I also did put saturation mapping because if you don't have that, it can also be even more punchy. So that was kind of how I used the color space transform S-Log3, S-Gamut 3 Cine to timeline, which is going to be over X7 and 9 2.4 is what I have, and then that's the settings I had for the color space transform. Color space transform is only available in DaVinci Resolve. It is a good basis. I've just noticed that what I've worked with is I wanted to have a little bit more space for creative LUTs, so I didn't want to be more punchy and saturated, so I kind of dialed the most saturated stuff down a little bit, and then I have a smoothing of skin that happens in the skin tone range with our base LUT is kind of what we did. Sony LUT. So this is the Sony LUT. Now the Sony LUT, you can see is extremely saturated on those channels. You can see it just getting really punchy. Everything else, it looks like the greens are shifting slightly blue in comparison to ours, obviously. And the skin tone is going to look a little bit more yellow. So it shifts a little bit to the side of the skin tone indicator right there. So Sony's going to be a little bit warmer on skin tone. Then let's take up Phantom LUTs. So Phantom LUTs is a really great LUT pack that a lot of people have used. It's supposed to mimic Ari's 709 look. And the thing to note is you will see that the reds are going to be shifted pink. So right here, this red patch right here is definitely going to push more pink. So keep that in mind. It does have more density in the colors, kind of like this color space transform. The yellow is going to be a lot more vibrant. But overall, I think things are pretty close. The skin tone's a little bit pinker. The blues lean a little bit more cyan. And they're just more saturated overall. So that's Phantom. And then Buttery. So Buttery, I personally don't recommend because it looks awful. It's just really yellow. And maybe this is just the version I have or whatever, but Buttery does not look like the way it was filmed, which is the goal with getting a conversion, is you want to have a good base and standard for what you build on top of it. And I personally would not use Buttery looking at this conversion for Sony. And this is the standard neutral version that they have. Tropic Color. So Tropic Color is a little, they said, a Rec 709 inspired look, which means it's going to be in the Rec 709 color space, but the colors aren't going to be exactly how they were whenever you saw them, which is kind of like Phantom, which is, leaning into a little bit, the hues are going to be slightly shifted a little bit differently. So Tropic Color is a lot more redness in the shadows of skin, I noticed. Again, they are also more punchy. You can see the red feels a little bit more neon and the pink is a little more vibrant. In this case, it also looks like they lift up the shadows. So the shadows are lifted here. The black levels don't go to pure 0. So that's a taste. So if you like to have your looks with a little bit more milky blacks, then this one could be a good start for you. And then last, we're going to look at LUT.co. Evan puts out some really great LUT packs out there. I actually know Evan personally. And he's got another really great one. I feel like the skin tone leans, it's pretty right on the line, and it's a little bit more slightly dense. There's more density to the shadows of skin tone, so more contrast in skin tone, which is fine. The only thing I noticed that's a little bit different is this patch of pink and purple. If you look over here, it looks like this has been pulled down in saturation level. Also a little bit of this green channel, or this green patch. So those are certain colors that if you're using it, just know that if you have a lot of pinks or purples, they might be subdued a little bit. But overall, the exposure is really good. Skin tone looks solid as well. And it looks like the black levels are pretty similar too. So yeah, so those are the differences. Now, one other thing, again, this is in one scenario. I haven't shown sunsets or dark environments or other things where the LUTs are going to respond differently. So I would take this as just a rough outline of how you analyze different LUTs and look at the scopes to kind of figure out what they're doing to your image. But if we come over here to a clip that we shot where a model was testing some samples, we have, let's see, right here. So this color right here, this was a very interesting, like orange salmon color. It's like reddish. It's got this really interesting color. This is what it looked like in person whenever we were filming. And I'm using my conversion. If we use the CST, it's going to be very similar. You're going to have a little bit more of a punchy, saturated color, but they're still really good. Sony LUT is going to lean more dark in that color, and it's going to be very saturated. Phantom, this one is where it changes the color. And the reason for that is part of that RA look is going to lean that section more towards the pink magenta range. So in this case, if I were to using Phantom, I wanted to have the actual color of that, I would have to compensate that with the color warper instead of using like a base where it was exactly how I saw it. Buttery, it's orange. Tropic Color is going to be, I'd say close to like the CST, maybe a little bit close to the Sony LUT. Very punchy still. And then LUT.co looks pretty solid. Just you get darker skin tone, more dense skin tones is what I'm saying. Everybody has different skin tones, which is fine. And this one's more even. So those are some of the things that I noticed whenever I was looking at different LUTs and we're comparing how they all perform and work together. But overall, that is, I think, what we wanted to talk about as we're going through all the different stuff on Sony, where we talked about our exposure, we talked about noise levels, the clipping points, S-Cinetone, zebras, and then also how we compare to all the different log footages. One thing I also want to recommend is that you can reference this blog post that we're going to have up. This blog post is going to be, we're going to add a lot of this information from this video in more dense material. I'm going to take more screenshots. I'm going to have it laid out. So this can be a great resource as you're moving forward with Sony and maybe you forgot some settings or you want to test some stuff. This is a resource for you. So you can go to our blog posts on gamut.io and you can get access to all this information that we'll have available whenever we finish this video. So, all right. So that is it pretty much. I'm going to bring on my good buddy, Levi.
Hey. What's up, everybody? All right, Caleb, we got a couple questions that we want to address today. Some of these about zebras, some about exposure levels, etc. So I'll just jump in with questions and then you let us know what you think. All right, so first question we had was from a bit earlier in the call. It was relating to histograms. It was from Priceless Studio Design.
Okay.
They're asking about the histogram. So does a histogram give you insight and help with noise and balancing noise?
Oh, sorry, say that again.
Will the histogram offer help with noise and kind of determining where your noise levels are going to be at?
This is a great question. So if we're looking at, let's change this to showcase our histogram. So if we're looking at this clip, let me go ahead and turn off S-Log3. So I would say this is extremely helpful to know where you need to lean with your exposure. This one's starting to get a little bit dark which means we're going to start getting into that noise floor. However, half this image is already in the dark, so it's supposed to be in the dark. I could use the histogram. It's a quick way to just look at it and see where you're at in the scene. If you have more even dynamic range, you just want to kind of keep it more in the middle. If you have a very bright scene, this will tell you right when you're clipping because you're going to get a spike on the right side of your histogram. And if you get too close to your blacks, you're going to get a spike. So I would say the histogram is very helpful if you can have that on your monitor, just as a quick gauge to make sure your image overall is kind of sitting in the middle and it's not leaning super strong one way unless that's the intent of your film. So I think that's the answer I go for.
Sweet. Okay. Next question was from Gustav here about S-Log3 on the A7S3. Yeah, they're asking what exposure do you aim for? 1.3, 1.7, 2. Like, what's your exposure levels? S-Log3, A7S3.
So with this one on A7S3, I would aim for 0. I wouldn't aim for 1.3, 1.7, or 2. And the reason for that is this clip over here that I was referencing earlier. This one is at 0 stops. Let me turn on the LUT. This one is going to be 1 stop over, 1.3, 0.7, and 2. So the reason for that is it's not necessary to overexpose, and I want to have a more evened image because I can protect some more of those highlights if I'm in a wide dynamic range scene where I need to protect those highlights. So a good rule is to just expose right at 0 to a half stop over. I would stick to that range. So I'm usually right. If I'm looking at a meter, it's hard to trust a meter because I could have this shot right here, and even though I want it to meter the chart, I would have to have a pinpoint metering for that. But overall, it's taking into account the whole image, and sometimes that's not the information that I want my meter to read. So it's hard to gauge with a meter, but if you had a controlled situation, I would lean into 0 to a half stop overexposed, and I wouldn't go over 1 stop ever, usually. The only time I would is if it's a dark scene and I really want to have a lot of the more information in the shadows because it's important to the scene and I don't want a lot of noise. That's the time whenever I would overexpose and then pull down in post, as long as I'm not clipping any highlights. So you can totally overexpose and expose to the right ETTR and then just pull that down in post and you get the cleanest shadows. However, the best reference is going to be skin tone. As long as skin tone lives where it should, and then my middle gray is dialed in. So I usually do 0 to half stop over.
Awesome, man. Great. We have a question from Yannick here about exposure. Now, I'm going to assume that this means by not introducing auxiliary or external lighting. So, Caleb, and I know they could do a whole live session on just this alone. So let's maybe just grab 2 or 3 things you think you'd suggest like off the bat. The question was, lost it. And here we go. I'd love to see how you recommend to get the best footage at nights for weddings. So wedding footage at night, what are recommendations?
So the big thing when you're filming in low light is what I'm going to say this as for night. Low light scenarios. We're going to need a lot of light because sometimes we can't control the light and we can't add our own light to our desired effect. So in that case, we have to crank up or let more light into the sensor, and there's multiple ways to do that. However, you want to stick with those native ISOs of 640, which is going to be low at night. So I would crank all the way up to 12,800. Now, again, when we compared S-Log3 to S-Cinetone, S-Cinetone only went to 2,000. So if I needed to hit 10,000 ISO, on S-Cinetone, it's going to be so much noise in the shadows because it's so far removed from that base or that native ISO, where with S-Log3, I would just bump up to 12,800, get a super clean image, and I'm going to have a really great workable image. So if you're filming at night, the best settings would be S-Log3, 12,800 ISO, get some fast glass if you can. If it's too bright at 12,800, then either add an ND, which I know is weird at nighttime, or just have like F4, F5.6, kind of stop down a little bit or stop up with your iris on your lens. But definitely lean into S-Log3. It is better in low light than S-Cinetone is.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt, for that. A couple more here. We have someone's having trouble, Forever Films Wedding. They have 2 questions here. They're talking about having some trouble on a couple different cameras. They're using both Sony conversion LUT and leaning LUT exposed to the right, 1.7 to 2 at base ISO. They're struggling with color noise in the dark, midtones, and blacks.
Okay. Yep. I have one. I see one of the questions that popped up. Conversion and leaning LUT. So just remember that I think on the FX30, the second native ISO is 2,500 ISO, not 12,800. So keep that in mind. So leaning LUT is created with highlights in mind. So if you're filming this shot, this is how leaning LUT would want you to add it. Let me see if I have his LUT. So you would shoot here. Let's go to leaning. I have everything. Gosh. I'm trying to think if I do Athena or LUT Pro. Let's try Athena 3. So very color accurate with the colors where they go. And you're going to have more of this evened out. So you have the cleanest noise when you shoot for leaning LUTs. However, it's extremely difficult to expose in camera or with a monitor and not with trying to properly look at it. It's going to look overexposed. I've heard a lot of complaints with people that expose to the right constantly as their go-to. And I feel like the focus should always be skin tone if we have skin tone in our shot. And with skin tone in mind, you don't want to think through exposed to the right because you're going to be focusing on highlights, not skin tone. Also, if this was all sunlight out here, then I would probably have to be, if I'm exposing to the right, I would probably be way down here because I'm protecting for that, and that's no longer incorrect. So the standard I would recommend is always for skin tone, which is closer to a middle gray reference, which is why I think middle gray is way better as an exposure reference point than highlights are. So it is very difficult to expose 1.7 to 2 over. The only way to do that I've felt is to take Leeming's LUTs and put it in a monitor and view it in real time and expose to what looks good that way. Because every time I've tried to do it on the camera, because I also have his for my other cameras too, every time I'm looking at my monitor, it just looks really blown out. It looks really white. I can't tell, like the image looks, it's just, I'm not inspired by the footage I'm looking at anymore because I'm so focused on trying to expose for the highlights that I'm missing what's actually happening in the frame. So in that case, I personally just don't choose to expose to the right. So I know that's a little bit tough, and I feel like there's not a lot. So color noise in the dark midtones and blacks. You should never have color noise in the dark midtones or blacks, especially with leaming. The only time you would is if you're not shooting base ISO, your native ISO. So if you are filming higher than your native ISO, you will have color noise no matter if you're overexposing or not. So make sure you're at your native first and foremost, and then expose for skin tone is how I'd recommend doing that.
Awesome, man. We do have a few more questions, but in the interest of time, because we have footage we want to grade,
Yep.
we're going to go ahead and pump those questions. We will post them later on the actual blog post on the website.
Okay.
But for now, we're going to kind of wrap questions for now and jump back into grading, because some people submitted footage and we want to make sure that we can get some of that graded.
Sweet. All right. So thank you all for hanging out too. And we're going to be doing this a lot more. Obviously, like I've said, this is just episode 2. We're going to continue this every week that we're in town. So every Thursday. So please join us. And we're going to be announcing pretty soon what next week's topic is choices. If you want to let us know what that topic is, let us know in the comments or send us a response to our type form that we've linked into this chat as well. And that lets us dictate what you want to hear from us. So if there's something you want to learn and we want to do a deep dive, we'll do it. Just reach out to us and let us know, and we'll try to make that happen. We've had a lot of people ask about Sony footage, so we went ahead and made a timeline with a lot of different submitted footage, and we're going to take a look at that now. So, all right. I've probably got a few sequences that we're going to look at in different scenarios. We'll start with this one. And if this is your footage too, you can let us know in the comments. But this is a really beautiful shot. So let's go ahead and come over here. I went ahead and grouped all these clips as S-Log3. So you can actually group them, S-Log3, and assign a group. And then I have my conversion over here. That way I can just apply everything to all the clips at once. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on our base LUT first, because I want to get a reference point before I start doing exposure or white balance adjustments like we did last week. So let's come over here. So now we are before the conversion, and the first things that we're going to do is we're going to work on white balance and exposure. So the first thing is going to be exposure, and then the second one is going to be white balance. Now, we've had a lot of people mention, hey, I would love to see this in Final Cut. I'd like to see this in Premiere. So I'm going to try to use only the tools that apply to all of those. I know if you were with us for episode 1, we went into deep dive into white balance using like offset, which is available in Final Cut, but it's not available in Premiere. And then we went over our curves, and we realized that curves, the function of being able to click on an image and see it plotted on here is not possible on Premiere. They don't give you a color picker for the curves, and then Final Cut natively doesn't allow that either. And I even tried it on Color Finale and it wasn't working. So unfortunately, that structure, which is really cool, is only for Resolve, but I'm going to work on gain, gamma, and lift. These are pretty much the standard across all the NLEs, and we'll work on getting the image dialed in for there. So the first thing we're going to do is exposure. I'm going to change to my parade, and it looks like we have a really bright image, and it looks like we have this cloud up here that's blown out. So we're going to darken this image, and one way I do that is, if you're in Premiere, you can use the exposure slider. I'm just going to do the gamma in the middle, kind of get a little bit more evened out, and then just check that gain to see how far are we off from that. So I'm going to reset that. So kind of get the exposure where I want it. And again, this is to get balance. This is not for look development. Look development, if you wanted like a bright and airy image, then after it's balanced, you would add a contrast bump to get it brighter if you wanted to. I'm not doing that at this point. And then white balance, this dress looks slightly cream, so it's not going to be perfect white. And also I know all this foliage is going to be bouncing on the dress. So we're going to be kind of referencing, and then also his shirt is a little bit on the blue side. So we have this kind of wide spectrum of whites. But we're going to try to get close, and I feel like overall, when I'm looking at this, it looks like skin tone is right on the skin tone indicator, but we're going to lean a little bit with our gamma and pull it towards the blue side, just a hair. Okay, so there's before, a little warmer, there's after, and that feels pretty clean. And then our black levels, you can see, are pretty close. We might be able to bump up just a hair. There we go. Okay. And then we are pretty much dialed in for that clip. I think there's another shot of this so if you notice, this right here is properly exposed. So we can look at this cloud where I can see the information here, and we see it's right at that level where we know that clipping is going to be happening at 88. Remember? So 88. So we have a little bit of space there. So let's take a look at the shot before, and you can see it's a little bit brighter. So in this case, this should have been exposed right about here. This is the optimal exposure for this clip, is right here. So we're going to expose for that one instead. So I'm going to actually go back to my gamma and get it back to where it was. So that feels good for exposure, and then white balance slightly adjusted. All right, so we're ready to, like, that shot's pretty much graded, and then we can go ahead and go to our timeline or an adjustment layer, and we can add a creative look. We have a variety of different ones. I feel like this one, since it's really, I feel like we could get some nice ones from Prestige. I feel like Adventurous Luxury, then that looks really good. Let's dial into taste, though. You don't always have to have things at 100%. Let's probably do that at 60%. Or Filmic Glam, that's a nice one. Wedding White is a really good one. So I kind of like Adventurous Glam. Like if I really want that warmth coming out, I want more of those yellows from that frame. One of our standard wins is always Dolce 4. Dolce 4 is a really clean one because it immediately gets rid of a lot of that mixed lighting color, and it looks absolutely fantastic. So I would say Dolce 4 looks really good. And then we can always play with, like, let's say HTFW Lux 1, or Lux 2 is a really smoothed out skin version. So let's go to a tighter shot. That just looks like money. It looks so good. And that one's, you know, less contrast in the skin, but it looks more soft because of that. So we've dialed in the contrast levels for skin tone in some of these LUTs to be really smoothed out with less contrast, and you get more even skin tone that way. So that is something to consider. And then we always have, like, I don't know, Adagio 1 if you want more of those pinker colors or warmer colors. So there's a lot of different looks that you can kind of create, but I think in this one I might go for Adventurous Luxury if I want to. So that was a great clip. Honestly, it was so well shot that we didn't really have to do much to it. All right, let's go do another clip. How about it? I'm going to turn off that. So let's go ahead and select all these, add this to the group of S-Log3. So now that they're converted, and we have a shot here. And let's take a look at it. This looks like just a cloudy day, so not a lot of contrast in this. So we might want to actually add a little bit of contrast to this clip. So the first thing, again, what we're going to do is we're going to do exposure. If you want to, you can separate contrast after it if you want it to be separate, or you can include that with your exposure node, and then white balance. And I can go ahead and just select this clip and take all these and paste them. So now I have it for all those clips. So we're gonna take a look at this clip. Exposure looks pretty good. It looks like we could use a lot more black levels, and it looks like it's lifted up in the blues. So we'll probably start with taking our lift and correcting for the black levels slightly. But if we do that, there we go. It looks more even. It looks like the highlights are pretty good. And then we're going to pull down our lift. Just going to get a little bit more there. We can add our contrast if we want to and spread out, but let's do contrast in the next one. So we can do it to taste. Again, this is a slider that you have in Premiere that you can do. In Final Cut, you would just use lift and gain and go back and forth is how I would do it in there. And then we can change our pivot specifically in Resolve to be a little bit higher on there. So I'd say those before and after. So far, it's looking pretty good. I almost feel like our white balance, there's not a lot of skin in this shot to see where it should line up. So we can scan to another section of the clip where we have a little bit of skin, but also it's going to be masked a little bit with this building, so it's going to be tough. So one way that we can do that is, let's go ahead and add an alpha key, and we're going to just add that there, power window up, and we're going to just draw a quick power window around skin. Let me make sure I got this dialed in. There we go. So just his skin that's, we're looking at. and it'll kind of show us here, and boom, it's on the skin tone indicator. So we know we're good with that. So I'm going to go ahead and just disable that. So I would say white balance looks pretty solid, and then after that we could start working with a conversion of some kind. Let me see what we do. Maybe let's do Orion or something where we could check out a shot, get some contrast in there. We could have a warm look. Another good one, well, one of the ones that we're leaning into new is some of our orange and teal pack that we're launching pretty soon. So this one's just really gentle, but just enough to give it that pop. And you can look at the scope here, the trace, and you want it to kind of be complementary, so the orange and the teal look. And the first one's going to be really strong, but you can see how it just pulls the greens closer to blue. Obviously, that's changing this sequence, so you'd want it to be, made for the right film. But overall, that's kind of a nice look. So let's take a look at some more shots. Here is one that we'll just do really quickly. So again, we have, looks like our exposure is pretty good. This looks like it's supposed to be black, but it looks a little bit in the bluer range. So let's go to the white balance, and we're just going to change our lift to even out with the other colors. Skin tone looks pretty solid. I mean, I know you've got yellow hair here and pink skin tone, so maybe we lean the gamma. If we want to change the white balance for just the skin tone, select gamma, just pull that over just slightly, and then we can compensate with our lift. There, got that. If we wanted to add a little more contrast, we could add it there, and then we can have a look. So if you wanted a really intense look, so, and what goes for the next clip. This one is interesting because we have this sunset right here. So if we have, here's our S-Log3 LUT. You can see right here this clipping point on our conversion. And right here we get it all the way to 100. If we look at a CST, CST is going to be pretty strong with the saturation. Sony LUT is going to be, you're going to be really blowing out some of that highlight. So you don't get that much highlight information or retention using the Sony LUT. So keep that in mind. And this is something that you wouldn't know until you're getting into different shots. And then let's try Phantom. Let's see what Phantom does. Phantom looks good. I know that theirs leans more pink, so you're going to have a better sunset probably. And then Buttery just looks warm. In this shot, it kind of looks good because it's combating a cold image. Tropic Color, kind of losing some of that information around the brightest section. And then Lutco here is nice and soft overall. But I feel like we've really worked through getting all that highlight retention out of those highlights in our conversion for base LUT. So in this shot, I bet this would be this one, because again, we want it to feel like it's a sunset. So I know it's going to be taking, the snow is going to be taking on the clouds. So we're going to kind of leave that's not perfectly white. We're going to kind of have it that way. And then you can add any kind of look that you would want. And I think you can get some really nice stuff here. So looks nice. Let's keep going because we got a couple more. This is a really good shot. Honestly, I think this one doesn't need much at all. If anything, it needs to be, maybe the image can be spread out a little bit, so we can go to our contrast tab and just increase contrast. If you don't have a contrast slider, you can just use your lift, bring it down, and then bring your gain up. So boom, just added contrast. And then we're going to look at the white levels. So it looks like it's slightly on the bluer side. So let's go to our white balance, take our gain, just push up slightly. There. Looks like we've got that. Now it's pretty even. Skin is right on the line. Easy, and we're done. And then we can add a look. So this one would be really good for an orange and teal look where you just have really good separation between those colors, but you get some really good vibrant shots. Another fun thing that you could do, if you want to bring back a lot of foliage or you want to pretend that you're putting on a polarizer on some of your clips, you can add our gamut boost LUT, which is literally magic sauce. This is one of my favorite things, especially for back in the day with Sony footage. It took off a lot of skin reflections and really smoothed out skin. So here we can have the before image and then after, and you can look at our saturation really isn't changing, but to our eye, it looks more saturated, right? It looks more saturated, but our scope tells us it's not. And what we're doing is we're adding density to all these different colors and making them come alive as if you're putting a polarizer on it. So there's a lot of voodoo going on in that one. And then you can just kind of make it pop, and then you can really add a look. And again, you get a really dynamic image that way. Let's go to another clip. Probably do a couple more. All right, so here's a good one. Let's take a look at this shot. So I can tell, so we get a little bit of pixelization in this these scopes, which means this shot was exported. This is not from the camera because it's actually 2 clips in one. So it just was exported with some lower settings, it looks like a little bit. So that's why we see what looks like kind of noise in the scopes, but it's not. It's just a little bit of degradation in the codec. So let's go ahead and change our exposure to be more evened out right there. That looks pretty solid, honestly. And then our white balance, we're going to be referencing her shirt, and it looks like the shirt is going to be closer to this red, green, and blue section. So let's take our gain. Oops, I'm in the exposure tab. Let's come over to white balance. Just kind of get it a little bit close right there. All right, so now we have before and after. It's now ready, and then we can add any kind of look that we want. Oh, that's the gamut boost. I'd say this one maybe, I mean, again, if we had Dolce 4, just kind of smooths it out. I know marble is a really good one too that a lot of people love. It's got a really nice warm skin tone. You get those brown blacks, and overall it's really clean too. However, if we go to the next section of this clip, it actually doesn't look the same. And I wonder if this second camera had a filter on it or not. But this shot, compared to this shot, looks different. This one looks sharper and more clear, so it could be a different lens choice or lens option, or it could be a different camera. I don't think it's a different camera because there's still S-Log3. Could have been a different one. Or there's a filter on front of this. So filters will affect some of the footage. So in this case, I would have cut this image in 2 and just match the contrast, because you can see the dark levels are lower here, and then here it's not. So that's just something I would come over here to the lift section and pull that down. So keep that in mind when you're mixing cameras. I do want to get to, I mean, this one, I mean, it looks pretty solid. I don't have to do too. Y'all just provided some really good footage, which is great. I think in this one, let's do it really quickly. Exposure looks good. Let's just touch our white balance. I feel like maybe just in our gain, just slightly. Right there. Looks pretty good. And then the blacks could probably just blend a little bit. Yeah, so before and after, it looks solid. Let me get to one. I think there's a complicated clip back here that could be difficult, or just a little more difficult. Let's see. Okay, so, all right, here we go. This one will be a nice, all right, let's try this clip. So in this case, I think this clip had a filter on it because it's got this crazy flare. Sometimes it could be the lens, but sometimes it's the filter. So in this case, if you want to restore a clip like this, let me kind of show you how to do it. Obviously, we want to get our exposure dialed in, so I'm just going to pull the gain down. And then because we have this lower range, we really want to pull the lift section. But we have to pull it so far down and then lift up our gamma and spread. We're trying to spread out that bottom section and give more dynamic range to that area. And then the whites, we have red, green, and blue. So the problem with using your gain slider is if you try to correct that, you can now see that our highlights up here are now not clipping white anymore. So I like to choose and fix white balance in the midtones in our gamma because it's not touching the highlights. So I'm going to just focus on getting the dress close, and then I'm going to come and compensate the lift. And just kind of do that little dance back and forth. Push it a little bit more there, and then pull it back right over here. So that gets us a lot closer to that working image, and then we could go ahead and crank up our gain if we wanted a little bit more. And then we could come over to this one. I would definitely probably use gamut boost. So this one is gamut boost just to kind of bring back more of that depth. And then we could maybe play that at 50%. And then we can come over here. And then I would just add like marble probably or something. Like this one right here it just cleans up those white levels so good. So overall you have that image, which is crazy. And then you have, let me just do 2 more steps. So this is what we worked with after conversion. This is us fixing the clip. And then here's adding a look to it, and instantly we can reuse this clip. So overall, I think that's a lot of different shots. I tried to go through as many as I could in the short amount of window that we did. But again, I really want to say thank you all so much for sticking around. I know it's kind of been a long form video, but you can always re-reference this video when it comes to Sony settings and everything. Again, if you have any questions, reach out to us, and we'll try to put that into any future episodes that we do. So, all right, well, I'm going to sign off. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week for episode 3.